You may have heard your grandma, your mom, or even your older brother say, stitching time saves 9, and here that's very true. Hi, my name is Matt Holmes, and today I'll be showing you how to stitch a seam using a backstitch. This demonstration would be relevant for someone who is creating an article or another sewn item and needs a stitch to join the pieces of that thing together. Say you have a dress that you're working on and you can't reach a certain area of the dress while you're stitching it with your sewing machine. You would need a way to connect those pieces together. That's a situation where the backstitch would come in. It also applies to someone who has a damaged item that's broken along a seam that needs to be repaired and they can't get to a sewing machine at that time. It's another situation where a backstitch would be applicable. I believe that I'm fairly experienced when it comes to this field. I have about 8 years of experience in sewing, among other fiber arts. I have given lessons to a class as well as had a few private students. First, we're going to go over the materials you'll need to do this task, and then we'll go into the process of actually creating the stitch. The first of your materials that you're going to need is scissors to clip your threads, trim your fabrics, and that sort of thing. You're going to find a pair that can cut fabric, preferably fabric scissors, but if you don't have fabric scissors, get a pair that can at least clip your threads. Then the second piece of material that you're going to need is your thread. You're going to use some polyester all-purpose Gutermann, which is fairly good thread used for such a project as this. You're going to need your hand sewing needles, one that correlates to the fabric that you're using. So your thicker fabrics, you're going to need a thicker needle. Thinner fabrics, you're going to need a thinner needle. The same applies to your threads. Thicker fabric, thicker thread, and vice versa. And then you're going to need the pieces of the garment or item that you're assembling. Here it's just going to be 2 strips of cotton canvas. You're going to need your pins, steel dressmaker's pins, or the plastic headed ones you can buy from Walmart work just as well. You're going to need your pencil to mark your stitching line, or chalk or another light colored item to mark it on darker fabrics. You're going to need your ruler or your protractor or another marking tool to mark your seam allowance. So the first step in the process is going to be to line up your pieces so that you can begin working with them. So you'll line up the edges, making sure they're nice and even. You want to match up any markings or anything that you have. And you'll draw on your seam allowance, which I've already done here at 1/2 inch. And then once you have your seam allowance on, your pieces lined up, you'll pin in the direction of your stitching. So since I'm right-handed, I will pin in the left direction, because that's the direction the stitch will make. So the points of your pins will face towards the left. You want to use enough pins to keep your fabric in place, but not so many that they bunch or bubble the fabric. Once you have that done, you make sure your fabric is laying flat, the edges are even, any markings that need to be lined up are lined up. You can set that aside. Once you've done that, you can thread your needle, which I've already done, using double strand thread. So double strand means that you're using one piece of thread that's been threaded through your needle and folded so that it creates 2 strands coming off the end of the needle. Then you'll tie your knot, making sure that the ends of your threads are even. To form your knot, you'll stretch the thread between your hands, pinching it, then you'll loop it over, bring the tail through the loop, and then pull on the needle end, which is the longer end, to tighten your knot, keeping it fairly close to the end. And then you'll repeat that 2 or 3 more times so that you have a nice firm knot to hold your thread in place. Once your thread's knotted, you'll come between your layers of fabric on your stitching line, however far from the edge you're beginning your stitching, making sure that your knot holds in place. But you don't want to pull too hard because it can pull the threads of the weave apart. Then you'll come around once you have your thread pulled taut, coming up through the same spot that you went up through last time, but instead of going through the middle between the layers, you'll go around the edge and through both, coming up through the same spot. Now make sure the loops that go over the edge are even and in line with your seam allowance line. So make your first stitch, you'll come down through your fabric, however wide you're making your stitches, pivot, and come up and through. Then you'll come back, go through the spots that you came down through before, pivot, and come up and through. You want to make sure you're catching both layers while you're stitching and using proper tension. So like with your thread and your needles, you're going to need a little bit gentler tension with your thinner fabrics, and you can apply a little more tug to your thicker fabrics. So you'll just continue that process down your seam, and for the sake of time we're not going to do the entire seam. Once you reach the end of your seam, you'll go down through like you're creating your next stitch, but instead of pivoting up and making another stitch, you'll go all the way through to the back of your piece, then go through back of your last stitch and pull until you just have a small loop. Then you'll go through the back of that loop with your needle and pull to tighten the knot you've just created. You'll repeat that 2 or 3 more times like you did with your beginning knot. Then once you've tied your 3 or so knots, you'll clip off the ends of your threads, and there we go. Your seam is tidied and clipped, ready to be finished off to meet the world. So when you're stitching, you want to make sure you're maintaining proper tension, you're pinning so that you don't bubble, and making sure that you're using the proper thread and needle to attach the pieces together. Off you go with your newly repaired or simply new thing. Probably took a few more than 9 stitches, but hopefully it saved you some more time.